Welcome to the Kurlavarki Memorial Lecture 2013. By now this is a well-established lecture which does not need a very long introduction, but I would still like, for the benefit of the students, to talk a little bit about who Kurlavarki was, in whose name this lecture series, an annual lecture, has been organized by friends of Kurlavarki and the students of School of Architecture. Kurlavarki was director of the School of Architecture from 1987 up till the time of his untimely passing away in an accident in 2001. During this period, he was the life and soul of the school, and previous to that he had taught at Nairobi and again at Ahmedabad and had worked in Professor Doshi's office, Vastu Shilpa. So he brought to the school a long association with education and an intense concern for the shaping of education in India as much as he had contributed in Africa. He was a teacher who was greatly loved, who spent a lot of time with his students, gave almost his entire life to this question of the relationship between teacher and student. And anybody who has been his student, like me and my friends, we cannot forget this man. He's shaped us. And so it is in his memory. Also, yes, one forgot that he had, on the Indian architectural education scene, he had made a major impact through the curriculum that was written on the 25th anniversary of the school in 1987, in which he was one of the very important key figures in writing that curriculum, which got adopted by the Council of Architecture as the curriculum at a national level. And then, of course, his continuous interaction with schools across the country can be seen in much of the kinds of work that come out from schools across the country today. And I think it has not been really properly understood, the extent of his contribution to education in India. So it is in his memory that this lecture has been instituted. And we have had very illustrious speakers speaking about architecture and speaking about their own work, but also speaking about education and society. Today we are very fortunate to have Jaimini Mehta as this year's speaker in the Kurlavarki Memorial Lecture. Professor Jaimini Mehta is a very well-known architect and educationist. He started his career at Baroda and Ahmedabad, went on to study and work in Philadelphia, where he also co-authored a book on Louis Kahn, having worked in Kahn's office as well, and working with Girgola. But then he came back to India in 1976, and he started teaching at this school from 1976. Right up to the early 2000s, he continued to teach here in spite of the fact that he had so many other commitments. He was head of the school at the MS University in Baroda for a long period of time, where he entirely transformed the school with single-handed zeal. Again, he was head of the school at Goa, which school too benefited greatly from Jaimini's presence. But this school has had a long-lasting, deep impact of Jaimini's thinking and working methods, and which is seen in so many alumni who have learnt with him. Equally, this school has had deep impact on him in more ways than one, both personal and professional. And we are very happy that Professor Jaimini Mehta, very deep thinker on education and on architecture, has consented to deliver this year's Kurlavarki Memorial Lecture. Professor Jaimini Mehta, may I invite you to deliver the lecture.
Thank you, Professor Chaya. I stand here today before you with a lot of mixed feelings. It is indeed a privilege to be able to stand here in this institution where I spent close to, if not more than 40 years of my professional life. 25 of those early years as an active faculty. When I recollect those years, my memory revived a series of encounters. I call this a place of encounters, actually. Encounters with people, with places, with events like this, with things, but more than anything else, with ideas, which have, in more ways than one, enriched my life in innumerable ways. The very first of such encounters involved Kurlavarki. After having worked and taught for 10 years in America, when I decided to come back, though she asked me to come here and teach. So when I landed on this campus in one July morning in 1976, though she introduced me to Varki and asked him to take me around the campus, which was actually not as big as it is today. It was only this building. Even the office and the auditorium part, library was not even built. And to introduce me to other faculty, colleagues, some of whom I knew already. And in general, make me comfortable. There was also another person with him, a young man, who had just a few weeks ago graduated from the school as an architect. And he was to assist me in the studio that I was to teach. Bright, with sharp eyes, equally sharp mind. I could not have anticipated that he was destined to occupy commanding heights in this institution. His name was Nilkant Chaya. We, as usual, sat at the canteen under the neem tree. By the way, this neem tree has probably witnessed more events of all kinds, academic, mischievous, even romantic, than any other place in this campus. I think that tree should be named as a Bodhi tree of the campus. Anyway, we sat there, three of us, with cups of teas. I don't remember how many. We talked and talked and talked for 2-3 hours maybe. Talked not only of architecture, but also about literature, about music, about politics, about society, life in general. I did not see the campus. I did not meet anybody. But I was certainly made to feel comfortable in the knowledge that there was somebody here with whom I could relate, with whom I could share my views, and who had a similar kind of passion for architecture that I enjoyed very much. He did make me comfortable in a way that I have never felt again after his tragic loss. Our friendship was a site for exchange of ideas and views regarding the nature of the architectural activity we are engaged in. We did have our differences, more about methods rather than substances. For example, he would often get exasperated by my rather unstructured and meandering ways to look for an idea. Over the years, I have learned to name that habit of mine. I call it reflective action. It involves starting somewhere, anywhere, whatever comes to mind, a sketch or an idea, and then reflect upon it, enlarge it, change it, modify it, reject it. It will lead to another action, another reflection, and so on and so forth, which led quite often to ends which are unpredictable, which excited me no end. Varkey, on the other hand, never set out on a journey without having some clarity on what he was looking for. That clarity came from a deep-rooted conviction about the things he held inviolable. It is this integrity, intellectual, ethical, and moral, is what made Varkey what he was. The seeds of what I want to talk today, the idea of agreement in architecture, not the kind of legal agreement that we understand, but something else, were planted during one relaxed lunch Sunday. I think it was in a city restaurant called the Collegian. It was closer to the city in those days. Now it is, I understand, very close here. Over a bowl of soup and sandwich, vegetable sandwiches, staple fare with Varkey. Besides, we could not afford anything more in those days. When I mentioned my nebulous ideas, as usual, I did not even know what it was, didn't have a name or a theme for it, but his sharp mind must have seen something and encouraged me to go on and develop it. It has taken me 15 years to reach a degree of clarity which makes me feel confident enough to present it in a public forum like this. So it is still a work in progress. Besides, CEPT University has a new and youthful president, and under his leadership has embarked upon an ambitious project called Reimagining Itself. I like that name, Reimagining. It has so much potential and promise. But it also requires an institutional imagination. An institutional imagination, if this act of reimagination is to go beyond merely restructuring an organization. An imagination which transforms an organization into an institution resting on the bedrock of our shared belief and values, on which we may anchor our recurring commitment for the ideas that the next generation is yet to have, which is very important for an institution like this. So it is only appropriate that today we restate and reaffirm those ideas and values held dear by people like Kurula Varki, and which increasingly seem to be on trial today. One look at our cities will tell us that at its worst, today's world seems to be a world in which people are intent on setting their own rules. On the other hand, at its best, it is a world in which the discrepancies, the paradoxes, and the rejections represent a way of relating oneself to the events, and in doing so, acquiring an awareness of the multiplicity of life. We architects are increasingly being pulled in different directions by these conflicting demands. Either we are asked to adhere to the most pragmatic and utilitarian aspirations, or we are expected to align our work with that which is in fashion today. The space for good architecture is fast shrinking. In such conditions, multitude of questions flood the mind. How do we define and understand the activity we call architecture? What informs what we do? What do we do? Why do we design? Has design any specific purpose in our life? Just as scientific discovery makes us understand the underlying order in the manifest world around us, does design serve a large purpose? What do we mean when I say I practice architecture? Towards what end? Is it to make a living? Is it to be able to pay for our daily meals and for our children's education? Is it to build shelter for the mankind or for the privileged few? How do I make my choices, given the range of options in front of me? Is there any set of ideas which may guide my work? So many questions. One of the things that is easily noticed about architects, at least some of them, is that they're very passionate about their work and are often intolerant of any lapse in quality or poor execution. Sheer survival is not enough to explain the high level of passion and attachment and commitment for which some architects are known to single-handedly pursue their goal. What is that goal? As for providing shelter to the mankind, we certainly do contribute towards the creation of the places of man's accommodations: houses, schools, workplaces, hospitals, etc. And of course, there is a degree of enjoyment in being able to fulfill this large need for the society. But this enjoyment must come as a byproduct of something else, which goes much deeper than the social obligation, which is utilitarian in nature and quite independent of the quest for quality and perfection, which distinguishes an architect's work. If an architect worked mainly to fulfill social obligations, which has its own rewards, and many architects are equally passionately devoted to such work, this passion, the latter one, is qualitatively different from the passion for perfection I mentioned earlier. Indeed, I might even venture to say that one is mutually exclusive of the other. For an architect whose main aim is to fulfill a social obligation may tend to overlook some shortfall in quality. And this will be true the other way around too. We will have to look for the meaning of our work somewhere else. At this juncture, I am tempted to describe to you a beautiful event I witnessed when I was a young, and one that may contain a hint of the answers we are seeking. It was a journey I undertook many years ago into lands that are far from here and Antipodean in many ways belonging to the different time, but not for that reason any less significant to us today. I am referring to the northern stretches of our country, the Himalayan wilderness, the northern provinces, where the boundaries between solitude and togetherness are often indistinguishable. This journey and the events I witnessed there has been forever etched in my mind, in my memory, and only many years later, when I was struggling to find meaning in my work as an architect, that I come to realize its significance. I had only been in the first year of my education as an architect when a young man in my class, whom I had befriended only a few months ago, invited me to spend with his family in his ancestral village in the remote Garhwal Hills in the northern provinces. The Diwali festival, the post-harvest festival of light and offering of thanks for the little mercies of God, for which the farmer is always grateful. His village was in that region where the rocky slopes of the mountain give way to the gentle plains, and the turbulent white waters of many adolescent rivers merge with and acquire the quiet dignity of the mighty Ganga. Great primordial forests must have once occupied these hills, which were now dwelling to men who still live with the ancient rites, but are no less wise for that. On the evening of Diwali, just before sundown, my friend, his name was Nori, said, "Come with me. I want to show you something." I had no idea what he wanted to show, but he took me in the woods in the direction of the river where we had gone every morning since I had arrived, and free of care and concern had splashed for hours in the cold mountain waters of the holy river, feeling invigorated and purified. But this evening, my friend's face suggested that the youthful frivolity seemed to be far from the objective of our journey tonight. We walked in silence, each of us filled with his own solitude, increasingly being engulfed by the growing darkness of the moonless night. The only sound, an occasional flutter of wings of a bird, sensing the danger of unknown intrusion into their domain. We were in a dazzling and secret world of nature, which at the same time was growing menace of cold and fear of the unknown. Everything became one: the solitude, the danger, the silence, and the anticipation of what I did not know. We continued till we came to the end of the woods. I could sense the presence of the river somewhere ahead, though I had not been to this particular place before. I suppose it must have been the feel of the ground below my feet. It had turned hard and rocky, and its gentle slope propelled me with an unfamiliar insistence to keep moving. In this darkness, I had the strange sensation that my whole body was alive and that I was one with my surrounding. Now, after many years, when I think back on that moment, I realize that though not by design on the part of my friend, but still by bringing me here in this quiet way, anticipation having taken me to the edge of my senses, circumstances has conspired in a strange way to prepare me for what was to follow. I was shaken out of my introspection when Nori put his friend on my shoulder and said, "Can you hear it?" Sure enough, from the direction of the village we had just left behind came a faint sound of singing. "Are they dancing?" I asked. "No, listen carefully." Yes, they were not dancing. Their song did not have the exuberance and the joyful abandon of young dancers. Instead, it was somber and devotional. And besides, the sound seemed to be coming nearer and nearer to where we were. We sat on a high boulder and waited. In the distance, I could see across the valley the dark silhouette of the distant hills with occasional flicker of light coming from scattered settlements on their slopes. The river, though shrouded in darkness, must have been down there somewhere. We must have waited for almost 10 minutes before the singers were close enough for us to understand what they were singing. Theirs was a song of praise and of gratitude of the joyful rains they have received, plentiful rains they have received, and the sunshine and the love and the good health. It was a song of joy. All the villagers, men, women, and children, singing in unison, were moving in a procession towards the river. Each of them had in the right palm a small earthen bowl containing vegetable oil and a cotton string which was lit on one end, forming a lamp not dissimilar to the lamps which had decorated their houses and their forecourts. In the warm glow of their own lamps, one could see their faces full of love and joy. Their singing was accompanied by several pairs of brass cymbals and drum, producing a percussion sound that filled the air. Suddenly, I also saw other similar processions of light and sound in the distant hills. Soon the hills were all lit up in the warm glow of tiny lights, and the sound filled the valley. All seemed to be converging on both banks of the holy river. Shortly, they all arrived at the river. Their singing had reached a crescendo. The cymbals and the drums were now beating a feverish rhythm. Everyone seemed to be in a trance. I could identify with them, for like me, they too had become part of their surrounding. Each of them had willingly merged their individual identities with the togetherness of the group and with the poetry of the event. As if on a signal, they started to form a single line facing the river. Soon there were two strings of light, each stretching almost a kilometer on both banks of the river. Suddenly the river came alive. Its calm water, a mirror-like expanse, reflected the light on the opposite bank. I became conscious of the flow of water and realized that now the song was gentler, its rhythm and modulation matching the flow of water. Without a break in the song, the people bent over and set the lamps afloat on the water. Hundreds of tiny specks of light filled the river and gently started moving downstream. The song continued in the same rhythm, matching the flow of water. The song, the light, and the river had all become one now. The river was set on fire by the generous offering of life back to the giver of life. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, it was not to seduce you by the poetry and the exoticness that I recounted in such great detail, a past event, reliving on this occasion a never forgotten occurrence in a land so far and so different from the one we are occupying this evening. I did this because I believe in the dark night lit by life itself, I sensed an important element of my work as an architect. I say sensed because only recently, many years later, that sense is beginning to form what might be called an insight, which may or may not be able to, I may not be able to articulate in my work and my words, but it will certainly explain me to myself. I believe in that simple ceremony, the inhabitants of the Garhwal Hills were engaged in an act of design. An act, an art is an action, which was more than a mere transformation of nature into culture. It was an unmistakable sublimation. Sublimation, a word almost forgotten from our lexicon. A sublimation of the daily experiences of being in that particular location, of going to the river every day, experiencing the gentle but firm flow of water, looking across the valley and sensing the solidarity of shared community, of illuminating one's evening with the flickering lamp. But above all, it was the sublimation in which all distinction between art and life became meaningless, and in which man and nature had joined as equal partners. The design of that ceremony was not aimed at any exigencies of the moment, nor was it to provide a solution to their daily problems. It did not in any way materially enrich them or ease the drudgery of labor, but it did dignify human existence. And to me, it informed the nature of that place, nature of man living in that place, and the nature of human construct, be it a simple ceremony, a poem, or a building, in a way that no description, not even this of my own, could possibly ever do. Many years later, and far from the solitude of Garhwal Hills, when I was in Philadelphia, preoccupied with more immediate concerns of building productions, I came across a quotation from Leon Battista Alberti, the Renaissance man, with which, had the man of Garhwal Hills been as articulate as Alberti, would certainly have agreed. It says, and I quote, "Arts were begot by chance and observation, and nursed by use and experience, and improved and perfected by reason and study," unquote. I'll repeat. Arts were begot by chance and observation, and nursed by use and experience, and improved and perfected by reason and study. This observation by Alberti seems to have been addressed to an artist as he proceeds, and defines his work. And it does have the simplicity of truth. You see, Alberti was an architect, among many other things, in fact, who believed architecture to be an art, as a way of life. In fact, he went through the pains of writing about architecture, not making theories, mind you, but condensing and sublimating, not unlike the man of Garhwal Hills, the experience of 10 centuries before him. He was rather looking for laws which set limits to architecture. Too often, theory proposes the absence of experience. It is believed commonly to transcend experience. The finding of law is instead the sublimation of experience. Alberti was looking for those laws which precede and determine the individual choices of an artist, without which no freedom is possible. Alberti believed architecture to be an art not distinct from life. But I believe this only partially answers the questions we started out with. How do we understand the nature of the activity we call architecture? There is something still not quite clear. One of the most perceptive and elegant thinkers of our time, Hannah Arendt, has come up with a beautiful formulation of an idea which may show us the way forward. Relying on a rich tradition of Western thought, and especially classical Greek thought, she has classified all human activities into three broad categories of labor, work, and action, and has given a radical new way of looking at our work. Labor, according to this formulation, constitutes all activities of man that is propelled by the necessity of sheer survival and is located at the lowest rung in the hierarchy of all human activities. Also, labor does not produce anything of lasting presence. What labor produces from the material taken from nature goes back to nature without leaving any traces. For example, what animals do all day in hunting, gathering, and consuming food cannot be called productive work. At the end of the day, what is produced as food goes back to the nature in the form of excreta, without leaving any permanent trace. In the same way, the product of human labor to transport something from one place to another does not produce anything. Even Karl Marx, who defined man as animal laborans, had to admit that productivity of labor, properly speaking, begins only with reification, with the erection of objective world of things. The work, the second category, on the other hand, produces durable things that constitute the man-made world around us. This man-made world, the home erected on earth and made of the material which nature has given to man, consists not of things which are consumed, but of things that are used. Thus, it is the end product that distinguishes labor and work. While the laboring man is referred to both by Karl Marx and Hannah Arendt as animal laborans, the working man is referred to as homo faber, man the fabricator. Fabrication is the work of human hands, which takes raw material from nature and transforms them into new forms through the process of making. Unlike the object of consumption, the things of this world are characterized by their relative durability, which make them independent of and outlive men who produce them and use them. The fabricating process, in fact, is entirely distinct and independent from the fabricated thing itself. And it is this independence of the fabricated object that gives it its duration and the thing-like character, without which we will not have the man-made world which mediate between man and nature. The third category, action, in fact emerges in the work of Hannah Arendt as a multifaceted category with thought, contemplation, speech, as well as action, all meaning distinct initiatives being considered in great details. However, in the end, she narrows it down to speech and action, two interdependent functions as truly human actions. We can thus provide a name, Homo communicator, for man in this category. This third category also differs from the earlier two in one very important way. While both labor and work can be performed by individuals alone, speech and action requires presence of others. In fact, plurality is an essential precondition for speech and action. Both are directed at others and are founded on the fact that each individual is a distinct and unique being. It is this distinctness that is being expressed and communicated in his speech and actions. It is evident then that the existence of public realm is essential for this to happen. Only in the public realm can man appear and express himself through speech and action. The outcome of both speech and action in their most evolved form is unpredictable. This alludes to the spontaneous and unpredetermined character of all creative actions. This is contrary to the convention and wisdom that one should know beforehand what is one is saying or doing. This may be true of a fabricator who has an idea, a mental image or a model of what he is making, but somebody who is undertaking a new initiative, the outcome is unpredictable. What is outstandingly clear from the above is the unmistakable convergence between this ancient Greek thought and the equally ancient Indian thought as expressed in Gita regarding the actions of man, that the innermost meaning of the acted deed and the spoken word is independent of the result and must remain untouched by any eventual outcome, by their consequences for better or for worse. Let me quote Miss Hannah Arendt verbatim in this brief and rather simplified reference to her startling and penetrating study of modern man. I quote, "Each individual in his unique distinctness appears and confirms himself in speech and action, and that these activities, despite their material futility, they also don't produce anything of lasting value like labor, possess an enduring quality of their own because they create their own remembrance. The public realm, the space within the world which man needs in order to appear at all, is therefore the more specifically the work of man than is the work of his hands or the labor of his body." Unquote. Thus, it is the creation of this very public realm, institution is what Louis Kahn called it, which is the end product of speech and action. I want to pause here for a minute and throw in a word of caution. Here, Hannah Arendt is following and confirming the classic mind-body duality that we have inherited since Renaissance, the Kantian and Cartesian duality. I do not fully endorse it. But for our purpose, we will suspend this disagreement with the philosopher and continue because we'll take it up a little later. The above formulation by a philosopher does not give us, or does give us, a much broader and comprehensive conceptual framework with which we can now return to our inquiry regarding the nature and meaning of architecture and to answer the questions we started out with. We have already noted that the work of an architect is often propelled by a passionate and sometimes poetic urge no different than that of the man of Garhwal Hills, to communicate to the rest of us a sense of order and the oneness, Advitiyam, in the world around us. This then locates architecture within the category of speech and action in Miss Arendt's scheme of things. This would mean that architecture, like speech and action, is ephemeral and has no material presence. But this is contrary to the conventional notion of architecture. As the makers of the man-made world around us, how do we resolve this apparent contradiction? We will be forgiven if we think of ourselves as fabricators, homo fabers. But then architecture is universally considered as a creative act, an act that brings about a new initiative. In ancient India too, even though architects have been referred to as Vishwakarma, the makers of the world, they always have been accorded a status much higher than that of the artisans, the Shilpi. I believe we can resolve this contradiction if we define architecture as an idea. Let us say that architecture is an idea that is embodied in the building. The building then is the carrier that carries the idea of architecture. But that begs several crucial questions. Are all building architecture? If they are all carriers of the idea of architecture, what do you make of the incredible variety we see in our cities today? This may suggest that the work of an architect is informed by his very subjective being, that it is his idea and his desire to communicate this idea that propels him and helps him make his decision. In other words, anything goes. I, for one, reject this simple conclusion. Unlike the work of animal laborants and of Homo faber, the work of an architect, if it resides in the realm of speech and action, happens in the public realm. This implies that far from being a subjective act whose validity lies only in the private reasoning of the individual architect, architecture is a public act. A public act can come about and has a chance of being sustained as an integral part of the public domain only if it has received an express or tacit agreement of others. Acceptance of the idea of architecture in the public realm is a precondition for the durability of architecture. I believe that that is what is implied when we say that architecture is the product as well as the reflection of the culture within which it was born. It is rooted in the time and the place of its making and derives its meaning through this rootedness. Still, our cities today are indeed chaotic, disorderly, and visually noisy. One may be forgiven to think that there is no agreement and that architects are simply exercising their free will. We are tempted to think of this as only a reflection of the fragmentary nature of the times we live in. That is why many of us yearn for earlier times when things were more predictable and great cultures evolved. Prince Charles of England comes to mind when I think of this. But apart from the apparent absence of the cultural agreement, there is still another level at which architecture must be seen as not being only a subjective and personal statement of an architect. The physical body of architecture, the building, once erected, becomes a part not only of the man-made world, but also of nature, and must then follow the laws of nature as is true of the entire objective world. The world erected by Homo faber may have given man an illusion that he, with his ability to erect an alternative world, can also control and rule over nature. However, it will be a folly to ascribe an adversarial and mutually antagonistic relationship between the two worlds. As Louis Kahn said, man is made of nature but is not nature. This suggests a rather complex relationship between man and nature, whereby, while man has the capacity to think and do what nature cannot, at the same time, what he makes with his hands and his body, as opposed to what he thinks and imagines, must be done in cooperation with nature and within the objective laws that govern all things. These two inbuilt regulatory mechanisms, agreement or being culturally rooted, and adherence to the laws of nature, one cultural, another natural, prevent architecture from falling in that pit where anything goes. Its genesis may be located in the deep psyche of an architect, and as such, it has no presence until it finds an embodiment in the building, which is an offering in the public realm, and as such can be sustained only if it has cultural validity and it is built within the laws of nature. The validity of architecture then relies on three variables. One, the desire of architect to express an idea, or the force or inevitability of an idea to find expression. Two, the agreement amongst his fellow citizens in the society. And three, cooperation with nature, either in the form of the material she provides or her laws within which the medium of expression, the building, has to be offered to the public domain. Out of these three, only the last, the nature and her laws, can be said to be relatively constant, and the agreement the most complex to understand. The agreement is also the least predictable of the three variables, for it involves finding a common denominator among a multitude of human psyches. For that very reason, it is also very fickle and short-lived, transient phenomenon. At its most ideal state, the agreement permeates the entire culture. It encompasses the multiple relationships between man and man, between man and nature, between man and society, and between society and nature, in tune with each other and are internalized by all. Such an all-encompassing agreement manifests itself in all cultural productions, be it literature, architecture, music, or a simple ceremony on the banks of River Ganga. But we do not live in such an ideal time. In fact, such idyllic cultural condition is a rarity. As such, it is easy for the agreement to be descend to the world of fashion and can be, without much difficulty, manipulated or manufactured. It is the objective of the modern advertising profession to artificially manufacture a social agreement by making an object or a design desirable or general perception of it being desirable. In fact, the transient nature of the object is a necessary condition in such a situation and is often built into the fashion agreement. In fact, the loss of the use value and the disintegration of the aura or the patina of the object is a precondition of the market economy, whereby not only the end of the object, but also the end of the desire for it is also planned in its own conception. We call it planned obsolescence. Obviously, Under these conditions, a building whose design is founded on what may be in vogue in fashion at the time of its making may not be or may be a short-lived object of consumption, and therefore neither the work of Homo faber nor that of Homo communicator. Such buildings may not be included in the category of architecture. On the other hand, when a stable and long-lasting agreement exists, architecture lends an unmistakable identity and aura to the society and its culture. Thus, when we refer to a period in history, say Greco-Roman, Romanesque, Gothic, Renaissance, Chola, Maurya Empire, etc., we imply that throughout that period, an agreement prevailed about the language of architecture and the system of its construction. There existed an underlying consensus about what constitutes the spirit of that society and its value and architecture that expressed it. A few of these buildings do it better than the others, and still a few others may break new grounds and may herald the arrival of a new agreement, a new worldview, and a new era. Such buildings transcend the durational boundaries of their own time and attain timelessness. We call them classics. Crystal Palace was one such classic work of architecture. Joseph Paxton not only captured and expressed the spirit of its time, but also pointed towards a new spatial conception and a new way to build it. Its expression was inevitable, and while the building is no more, it has left behind a lasting remembrance, to quote Hannah Arendt. The idea had its inevitability about it, and had it not been for Paxton, someone else would have built it, maybe differently. In early 1960s, the British group Archigram had already sensed disaffection with the orthodoxies of the modern movement and had proposed alternatives with their visionary images of walking cities, etc. The work of this avant-garde group was initially seen more as a curiosity, though it did help in crystallizing an agreement that ultimately made it possible for Richard Rogers and Renzo Piano's Pompidou Center to be received favorably in Paris. I consider Pompidou City as a direct descendant of the walking city. But then, could the timelessness of Crystal Palace imply that it could have been built by the Greeks in the 5th century BC or during the Middle Ages? Conversely, could we build Parthenon or the Reims Cathedral, both of them timeless, today and call them architecture? The material and the intellectual conditions in which in Greece and during the Middle Ages will not have given birth to or supported the Crystal Palace, and only under two conditions can we conceive of building Parthenon or Reims Cathedral today, as at its best as a quotation mark within a larger work, as a semiotic statement to make a point, like many Greek revival facades on the 19th century banks, or at its worst, as a fashion statement, as an object of desire or a commodity of consumption. In either cases, they will lie outside the realm of architecture in its true sense. Obviously, we are confronted with a plurality of conceptions or agreements about architecture today. Architecture has always been reinterpreted, reinvented, and its objective redefined to arrive at an agreement that was in harmony with the prevailing material and intellectual culture of the society. For example, each of the three vertices of Vitruvius's celebrated triad, Venustas, Firmitas, and Commoditas, has been given primacy over the other two at various times throughout history. However, there has also been a core belief in the ultimate validity of architecture that has remained and survived the plurality and the historical progression. This we have not yet articulated. This core belief, I believe, must be found beyond history and beyond evolution. It must be located in those moments when the work of Homo faber, the utilitarian and mechanical structures that constituted the built world around us, was transformed and elevated from the mundane to the sublime. This transformation also, at the same time, transformed man from mere fabricator to man the communicator. With these, man had crossed that line separating the realm of labor and work and found his speech and action. This happened in all the cultures and civilizations. Need for shelter, or for a place of worship, or for a place to store grain, resulted in the initial act of building houses, temples, or granaries by the early man. Following the logic of construction and the laws of nature led to the acceptance by the entire community that some solutions are better suited to the situation than others. These building solutions became the repository of the collective memory and the knowledge of the people. Everyone recognized and accepted them. Here we have the first level of agreement. This may have given rise to a group of master craftsmen with the authority to interpret the community's building needs and provide appropriate solutions. Through rigorous and constant practice, these master craftsmen had made the craft of building their second nature, and in due course of time, some of them created buildings that not only had perfected the traditional ways of building of various elements of a house or a temple or a granary, but in their very arrangement of the parts, in the relationship with the world around them, sublimated the experiences of the culture and made others also sense it. Those buildings acquired iconic status. Everyone looked at these buildings in awe and must have nodded their head in agreement. At this point, those buildings had truly left behind the initial utilitarian reasons that had brought them about in the first place. Those reasons still remained, and the buildings continued to play their assigned roles of being houses, temples, or granaries, but there was something sublime about them that made everyone sense reality deeply. This is done not by mimicking the reality, but by representing it. In other words, they embodied the idea of architecture. At this moment, those buildings became architecture. This phenomena is independent of history and geography. It is true of Parthenon as much as it is true of Crystal Palace. Equally true of a simple barn in the middle of an American farm, a veranda in the Mexican hacienda, or a courtyard within an Indian haveli. They point towards the essential duality of the act of architecture and tell us of an inseparable relationship between the idea of architecture and the craft of building, the mind of man and his hands and body. One resides in the realm of cerebral, while the other in the sensual and the experiential. Together, they represent the totality of architecture. The relationship is neither hierarchical nor is sequential. Much of great architecture is the result of this process. The real contact with the architecture and with the architect is made then beyond learned expressions of aesthetic styles, when the substance of man's existence as an individual and as a community is simply but uncompromisingly stated. This does not occur simply because formal synthesis is obtained, but rather because a comprehensive idea of architecture is validated. This happened in a simple barn in the middle of American farm, or in Mexican hacienda, or in Indian Haveli. And for sure, it was present when the man of Garhwal Hills evolved that simple ceremony of thanksgiving. However, the simple certainty which resulted in these examples is no more obtainable today. Today's architect, as a consequence, is also bound to the destiny of his society and his institutions, not unlike the master builders of the past, even though he may at times appear as an individual enjoying what may be only an illusory freedom. His role is in living the process of the events and taking upon himself the great risk of realizing the conjectures and the possibilities of that society. In particular, realizing the link between the infinite of nature and the finite of man. Thus, he is a person. An architect is a person willing and capable of taking that risk for a better or more conscious world, fully knowing that its future must be painstakingly built upon the present. In this, he is forever engaged in articulating the agreement. If he is an author, he is an author not only of his buildings, and this is more significant, of the agreement that revalidates the comprehensive idea of architecture. That can be the only precondition for the authenticity of the work of architecture today. If we can achieve it, who knows? We may still be able to build cathedrals which were white. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jaimini, for continuing a discussion which all the panelists will recognize, and students too, began earlier in the day along these drawings. And I'm sure that both the students and the panelists will have very fruitful discussion with you further on this. I believe that it will not be the right moment at which to ask questions right now. But since you are going to be here tomorrow, I invite all students and even others who are here who would like to come and talk to Jaimini and continue this conversation that you have begun so characteristically well. We are deeply appreciative, and thank you very much, Jaimini. Thank you. Tomorrow's program includes a lecture at 6:30 at the King's Pavilion at Sarkhej by Peter Rich on his work. Through the day, the students will be meeting for a continuation of the Kurlavarki Forum, and all the people who have come here will show their own works through the day. On Monday, there will be a talk on the making of the Patliputra Museum by Rahul Gore and Sonal Sancheti. And there will also be a small exhibition of Fumi Ekomaki's work. So you are welcome to attend all of these events. Thank you very much for being here.